Well, okay. Could I ask everybody, please, if they would
lying here,
if they would kindly mute themselves, George and Muriel.
Yep.
If you would kindly mute yourself, that would be good. And very happy to introduce our ALBA leader, our ALBA party leader, Mr. Alex Salmond, Scottish patriot and fighter. Alex has not been spending time at the Edinburgh Fringe, but has been on a Scottish tour of Wee ALBA book meetings like this one, now scoring over 40 such meetings and all of them packed out. We may not be a very big turnout today, but we certainly span many thousands of miles. So that's quite unusual and distinct. It's a particular pleasure to introduce Alex in the week that Salvo and the SSRG, the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, launched the Scottish Proclamation outside Alistair Jack's new palace in Edinburgh. The media silence speaks volumes. Welcome to Alex Salmond. Alex.
Thank you very much, Maggie. That's a very kind introduction. I should correct you on one point that we did actually have one of our Wee ALBA book meetings at the Edinburgh Fringe in Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago. So, I mean, there's and of course I've done shows on the Fringe myself. So I'm not one to complain about doing shows on the Fringe, although you know, perhaps there might be a question about the numbers you do. But the meeting in Edinburgh was very successful, actually, as indeed have been all the meetings around Scotland, and they've been very instructive because, apart from being able to disseminate the information in the Wee ALBA book, it's certainly given me an opportunity to gauge the temperature of people in the national movement. And what comes across more than anything else is that the people are very keen on getting a sense of direction. People can sense an opportunity, and of course the temperature's rising, because after all, we've been promised a referendum on October the 19th next year. So it should be game on for the independence cause. And obviously, in the state of the current crisis, the cost of living crisis, in particular the energy and fuel crisis, you know, people, you wouldn't have to be Einstein or even the most acute observer of politics to understand there is a substantial opportunity for an energy-rich country whose people are being threatened with being blanketed in fuel poverty to assert the right to independence and the right to control their natural resources. So what I've sensed from the Wee ALBA book meetings is both a sense of opportunity and also a wish and a need and a requirement for direction on how independence is to be achieved. It should be said also, of course, that the purpose of the Wee ALBA book was to, and is to bring the case for independence up to date, because a lot has happened in the world since 2014, not least of which is Brexit, but there's also a war in Europe, the pandemic, a range of things which impact on the case for independence. And there is a requirement to make sure the case for independence is up to date and is about 2022 and beyond, not the world of 2014. And I think in modesty, so, I mean, this is an ALBA meeting, an ALBA International meeting, but an ALBA meeting. We can claim that the Wee ALBA book is the most substantive piece of work done since 2014 in terms of bringing that case for independence into the modern era. And best part of 100,000 of the Wee ALBA books have now been distributed around Scotland, and hopefully we'll be ordering yet more, and that'll be the subject of debate at the upcoming conference as to how we style that and how we do that. No doubt we can enhance version 2, edition 2 of the Wee ALBA book will be even better than edition 1. But it's been a big contribution. It's a wee book, but it's a big contribution to the independence debate. In terms of people looking for direction, I think three things. One is there's some perplexity as to why the the case for a referendum isn't being forced on Westminster at the present moment. Now, I've been knocking about politics for some considerable time, and I can't remember a moment where there has been more disarray at Westminster. I mean, quite clearly, the Prime Ministership of Boris Johnson was an uneven passage, to say the least. But the leadership contest, the Tory party, was a dog and cat fight, basically, between two candidates who were obviously and demonstrably unsuitable for the job. And in the way of the Tory party, you can always be certain that they will elect the worst candidate. And that's what the Tory party election system does. It almost guarantees you'll get the worst candidate for the job, and Liz Truss looks like the worst candidate for the job. I mean, in terms of responding to a cost pressure inflationary crisis, to burble on about tax cuts, it would, as Richie Sudak absolutely correctly said, lead to short-term and immediate and cataclysmic economic disaster. And it also shows the prejudices of the Tory party, which are overwhelmingly more important to them than actually dealing with a crisis which is affecting the vast bulk of working people across the country. So we can assume that Liz Truss's prime ministership is going to be a similar rocky road, probably for different reasons than Boris Johnson, but in terms of ability, she has a great deal to prove, and there's nothing about the campaign that would suggest that she's got the intellectual and political equipment to deal with the extent of the crisis the UK faces. Now, in the words that I think were first used by Daniel O'Connell, the great liberator in Ireland, England's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity, and Westminster's difficulty should be Scotland's opportunity. I mean, this should be a moment where the politics of Scotland are able to be forced on an unwilling Westminster government. But to do that, of course, requires determination. And the sort of determination, Maggie, that you referred to with Neil Hanvey and Kenny McCaskill demonstrated at the end of the last session of the Westminster Parliament. You need parliamentary action. Now, two ALBA MPs giving the Speaker apoplexy for a single day, it will not in itself bring about Scotland's right of self-determination to be exercised. But that should be repeated every day until Scotland's rights are recognised. And there's almost 50 MPs in the House of Commons from Scotland who believe in Scottish independence, or say they do. And the rule book of the House of Commons, gives ample opportunity to dictate an agenda on a daily basis, and that's what should be done. You can't just sit and accept not just the latest meanderings in the Telegraph saying that they would rig the rules of any referendum that they have no intention of agreeing to. You don't just sit back and take that sort of stuff. I mean, parliamentary representatives from Scotland have the obligation to do something about it. So if every day of the House of Commons, in addition to the political and economic crisis the UK in, was dominated by MPs of vigour and determination, like Neil Hanvey and Kenny McCaskill, asserting Scotland's rights and saying we will not be ignored, we will not be turned down, we will not have our democracy denied, then you'd have a totally different political situation. And that should be backed up by popular demonstration, peaceful demonstration, but popular agitation in Scotland, the sort of activity that ALBA and all the other groups are going to be engaged in at the Yestival on the 18th of September in a couple of weeks' time, 2 weeks exactly, actually. We should demonstrate in the ground in Scotland the desire of the Scottish people for self-determination and our unwillingness to be held prisoner politically in what's meant to be a union of equal nations, and which was always previously accepted as a voluntary union. And thirdly, that should be, and this is where International ALBA comes in, ALBA International comes in particular, that the parliamentary agitation, the popular agitation, should be backed up by diplomatic initiative, taking that case to the world. So that's what should be happening now, and that's what ALBA are pressing for, and that's what ALBA MPs have demonstrated they're prepared to do. And the ball is really in the court of those who have the responsibility. I mean, there is an interesting and lively debate which Maggie referred to, of Scotland's line of popular sovereignty, of the the right of the Scottish nation, of the community of the realm, of the claim of right of Scotland through the ages, from the 14th century right up to the cross-party initiative of the 1980s. And that's a great debate and a good debate and a strong debate. But the people whose Scottish sovereignty is vested in at the present moment, the custodians of Scottish sovereignty, are the members of Parliament and members of the Scottish Parliament from Scotland. They are the people who've been elected on a mandate to progress the issue, and it's their responsibility to do so. And thus far, we have the demonstration that Neil Hanvey and Kenny McCaskill, and perhaps there are a few others in the SNP ranks, are prepared to accept that responsibility. But unfortunately, there's plenty of indications that a lot of people are not. And that is a responsibility people shouldn't escape from. You can't palm it off onto someone else. If you're elected on that mandate, you've got a responsibility to deliver it. So the first sign of perplexity I get at the Wee ALBA Book meetings is people are looking for that leadership in that campaign, and ALBA must make its contribution to provide it, just as ALBA International should make its contribution, as you are doing very effectively, I can say, in terms of arranging the international promotion of Scotland's case. I've just returned from Catalonia on a highly successful visit, which provoked great interest, talking about the national movements in Catalonia, in Scotland and Ireland, and the need for international cooperation. There is a need, and ALBA International are on this case, to take the Scotland's case to international authority. We're needing to, and this is going to be arranged, it is arranged actually, we need to be talking to EFTA, we need to be talking to other international organisations which are going to be part of Scotland's process. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I've made no secret of this, that I have grave doubts about Nicola Sturgeon's strategy of going to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, asking for validation of Scotland's right to hold a referendum. The experience of nations going to the Supreme Courts or constitutional courts of their host country is not a happy one, as anyone in Quebec will tell you about the Supreme Court of Canada, as anybody in Catalonia will tell you about the Constitutional Court of Spain. By and large, it is not the experience that Supreme Courts of the host country are going to rule in favour of people who are aspiring to independence. And the overwhelming likelihood, I mean, nothing is certain in politics, life, or before courts, but the overwhelming likelihood is that the Supreme Court will knock that down, will turn it down, and will interpret the Scotland Act of 1998 in a restrictive way, and will look only at that act. And the fact that the Lord Advocate does not, to use her own words, have sufficient confidence. This is our advocate. This is the person who's meant to be advocating Scotland's case in the case herself to take it through the Scottish Parliament. Doesn't fill one with confidence that there's going to be a positive outcome. And of course, in terms of a court action, in terms of asserting the Scottish Parliament's rights, if you are engaging in a court action, or a court action is going to be engaged in, overwhelmingly for political and legal reasons, the way to do it is to take legislation through the Scottish Parliament first, and then have it challenged from outside, because then two things. One, the argument about it not being immediately relevant, which the UK government is making, falls automatically. And secondly, courts can be quite leery of overturning democratic decisions. But to actually go in advance to a court and say, we're looking for your advice, really doesn't give you a great amount of room for manoeuvre for complaining about it after they give you the advice you've asked for. And it's seldom a good idea to ask a question unless you know what the answer is going to be. And insofar as we know what the answer is going to be, it's not going to be a positive one for Scotland. And I am bemused as to why this is thought to be a sensible strategy. I mean, the threat, the potential option of holding the Scottish Parliament holding their own referendum in the absence of an agreement from Westminster was one factor, not necessarily the only factor or even the most important factor, but it was one factor in persuading David Cameron and George Osborne to agree to the Section 30 back in 2012. It was because one of the reasons they agreed to it was they thought if they didn't agree to it, Scotland was going to go its own way anyway, which was going to be a a lot less pleasant for them than to apparently still be in control of events by having an agreed referendum. To give away that card is a serious matter because we've had a strategy in Scotland for the last 30 years, which has seen first the achievement and then the ability of that parliament to progress the movement towards greater autonomy and independence as the strategic route to independence for Scotland. To apparently leave the future of that strategy in the hands of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. We were sitting in Middlesex Guildhall, 2 minutes walk from the Palace of Westminster. It seems to me not the greatest piece of strategic thinking I've ever seen in the progression of the national movement. We run the risk of closing off an avenue towards independence that's been one of our key weapons, or kind of our key parts of our armory in terms of the political battle for independence over the last 30 years. So I'm no fan of going to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. The third aspect is, of course, if it came to a plebiscite election, as Nicola Sturgeon has called it. Now, that has possibilities. If you wanted to win a plebiscite election, then it seems to be pretty obvious, and to the national movement pretty obvious, that you should do it as a united front, that all independence parties and supporters should gather together behind one candidate in each constituency. That sort of manoeuvre has been done before, not in the cause of independence, but it was done 100 years ago in the cause of Lloyd George. Lloyd George fought the 1918 UK general election, the coup-in election it was called, that candidates from the Conservative Party, most of them were from the Tory Party, but from Lloyd George Liberals, from the Labour Party and others, fought under a Lloyd George coup-in. So those who had the coup-in was very successful in preserving the Lloyd George Prime Ministership, at least for 4 years. So you can do it. I mean, you would fight in that argument on the political parties having their own name, SNP, Greens, ALBA, and then having Scotland United or some indication that they were fighting together as one candidate in each constituency. Now, that would maximise the chances of winning. It would maximise the vote that you could get. And above all, it would crystallise the argument that this was a one-issue election for the independence candidates, because the other side are not going to accept the plebiscite election. They're going to say it's about a whole range of other issues as well. And of course, if you fight on a political platform, then it's very difficult for people not quite legitimately to say, well, we actually want to talk about the SNP government's record in Holyrood, which we don't think is very good. Or we want to talk about the Green Party's attitude to women's rights, or the whole range of issues, which we don't agree with. If you want to crystallise the issue around independence, which would be the whole basis of a plebiscite election, then you'd want to fight it as Scotland United. That would be the way to fight it if you're trying to win. And secondly, if you're fighting an election as opposed to a referendum, then to put the target as a majority of votes, it seems a strange thing to do. I mean, elections are about electing MPs, getting a majority of MPs. For years and years and years, it was nominally accepted by Prime Ministers, Harold Wilson, Margaret Thatcher, that if the SNP ever succeeded in getting a majority of MPs and sent to Westminster, then of course they would have the right to assert independence. I mean, that's in the Downing Street years, Margaret Thatcher's autobiography. The quotes are there. Indeed, the Lord Advocate, the strongest argument in favour of Scottish self-determination in the Lord Advocate's submission to the Supreme Court is actually a quote from Margaret Thatcher. I mean, I might have thought that she would find other authorities who would be more credible advocates of Scottish self-determination, but that is just true. If you look at the Lord Advocate's submission to the Supreme Court, and she alights on a quote from the Downing Street years, where Margaret Thatcher said, if the Scots ever determined on independence, no English politician should gainsay that, and she certainly wouldn't. Now, if we can't rely on the late Lady Thatcher as our prime advocate for self-determination. There are many other people who've articulated that case and that cause. So a plebiscite election has possibilities. ALBA would certainly want to participate constructively in such an election. But you have to draw the rules up in a way that maximises the vote by fighting at Scotland United. And you have to draw the rules that you're at least drawing up in a way that you're possibly going to win it. Otherwise, our opponents no doubt would say, well, you had your second plebiscite election, and that's now another 2 generations you're going to have to wait to progress the independence cause. So what I'm saying basically is this, that there's never been a time more redolent with opportunity to progress the independence case and cause in Scotland. The people are willing. I've got no doubt about that. Every single ALBA Book meeting is packed out basically around the country. I'm sure that will be demonstrated at the ALBA conference, at the upcoming meetings in September, and indeed at the Yestivo on the 18th of September, that there is a great enthusiasm and a great sense of political opportunity. But people are looking for direction and leadership, and they're looking for the information, the sort of answers to key questions that are contained in the Wee ALBA Book. And here ALBA International comes in particular, we have to be prepared to progress our cause internationally. Because if, as I suspect, the UK Supreme Court, the domestic courts, if you like, of the United Kingdom, turn down the Scottish argument, then we have to look internationally, international courts. And here, of course, the work of organisations, which Maggie mentioned, is particularly important. That argument, that case will have to be progressed. Remember, however, and that's an important role for ALBA International, the more we do of that, the better. Diplomatic pressure in the current circumstances is going to be a vital part of the argument for independence. It should be said that we all know that the heavy lifting in independence has to be done in Scotland. That's where the argument will be determined. The international appeals to a variety of international bodies are really, really important, but they'll tend to judge in your favour in terms of international courts after you've actually won independence. Most of the previous examples to say, yeah, that was a good idea because they've won it. If we go back in Scottish history, back to one of the appeals to international jurisdiction that was made in the 14th century, the Declaration of Arbroath to Pope John the 22nd. Well, that was a successful appeal, but that was kind of connected with the fact that the Scots had already won in Scotland when they made the appeal to John the 22nd. And therefore, we have to recognise that we have to win politically. That's the key. And to win politically, we have to offer a viable strategy for achieving independence. But I would just like to underline that the work of ALBA International and what you're doing now in setting up meetings and contacting people internationally is of huge and significant importance.
Just as I'm now in a Zoom meeting, but like, hopefully not.
I know we've got an additional person on the call, which is excellent, Maggie. But I was bringing my remarks to a close at that point anyway. So what I suggest we go into questions, and I'm very happy to elucidate. But I'm extremely pleased to see such a gathering from around the planet and interesting listening to Scotland's cause.
You're muted, Maggie.
Maggie, you're muted. It's always difficult when you're chairing. You have to remember everything.
Thanks so much, Alex. You've given us lots of issues to talk around, and I'm sure there's going to be really lots of interest via question time. I think also when you're before you ask your question, I think it would be good if people can indicate where they're coming, geographically, where they're coming from. I think that would be interesting for people to hear. So I'm wondering now who's going to come in first. We've already said if you could raise the little yellow hand button, raise hands, which is down under the reactions button. If people could, okay, and I can see that.
You got the first.
James.
You're muted, mate. You're still muted. Still?
No, you're still
There
muted.
you go. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah. Alex, lovely to hear from you. Some great words there. In terms of location, I'm down in London. I do apologise for that. But been down here 20 years, but no less a supporter of Scottish independence than the day I left Scotland. The question I was wanting to ask you is in relation to the plebiscite election. I agree. I don't think we've got any chance of the Supreme Court in London, giving Scotland any chance of a referendum. They'll stick to the British establishment view of things. I have a huge fear over the plebiscite election, and maybe it's a cynic in me, and potentially that the SNP will use it for their own devices rather than towards Scottish independence. You talk about Scotland United, but my biggest fear, and given some of the, and I know it goes in both directions, some of the words between some of the SNP towards ALBA and the people within it, which is sometimes a lot stronger than it is towards the unionists. My fear is that if we get to the point of a plebiscite election, rather than getting everyone together, every party, every organisation, the SLP will push for them to be the party that goes on the ballot paper and no one else, to the extent that they become a party with 50, maybe virtually every seat in Scotland. And unfortunately then, given some of the SNP at the moment, we're no further forward. So if that's the ruse they try to pull, how would you see yourself and ALBA and the other parties dealing with that? Is there a solution to it? Because my biggest fear is that they'll take over the whole thing for the SNP ends rather than independence.
Well, I mean, what ALBA can do is put forward the argument that the best way, if it's going to be a plebiscite election, the best way to fight it is a Scotland United, in the way I suggest. I mean, obviously, if you did that, then the vast majority of candidates would be SNP MPs. You would expect all of the SNP MPs who were going forward to be the candidate for Scotland United in their constituencies, just as you would expect the ALBA MPs to be the candidate for Scotland United in their constituencies. And you'd because the other party, the Green Party, with parliamentary representation in Scotland, you'd expect the Green Party to have some seats on that basis as well. But that's how to, if you're having a plebiscite election, that would be how to do it to have a chance of winning. And as I say, another key point is not to set the bar at a level that can't be won. I mean, to give you an example, I mean, even in the annum mirabilis of 2015, where the SNP was not fighting on an independence ticket, remember, I mean, that's not one of the four mandates that there are for an independence referendum, for understandable reasons in the aftermath of the 2014 referendum, but where the SNP achieved just short of 50% of the vote. And there were very, very important circumstances, and the buyer's regret of Scotland in the aftermath of the referendum, the dawning realization that the vow was going to be betrayed, as promises have been so often betrayed in the past. So that was a very, very peculiar circumstances, and the SNP just fell short. In Harold Wilson's best year, the Labour Party just fell short of, I think 1966, the Labour Party fell short of 50% of the vote. Sometimes cited that the Tories got it in 1955, but they didn't. They got it in alliance with the National Liberals. So, it's never happened as a single party in Scottish, well, certainly since in democratic history, it's never happened. And therefore, to set that as the bar in a parliamentary election seems extraordinary. Parliamentary elections are decided in numbers of seats won, not decided in anything else. I mean, if it was decided on 50% plus of the vote, there would not have been a UK government in the course of the last century, or just about anyway. So that would be my key concern. But in terms of trying to get it onto Scotland United platform, all ALBA can do is put forward constructively how that should be done. The one thing I would say, James, is that in the meetings I've been explaining this, there seems to be a temptation to jump fences just now. I mean, what should be happening now is political pressure on the UK government to concede an agreed referendum. I mean, you know, before we start seeking other mandates, there's 4 mandates already, you know, 2 general election mandates and 2 Scottish election mandates for that. So, you know, that's what should be done now. And, you know, I can't think of a moment, as I was saying earlier, where that's got more opportunity for success. This is an extraordinarily weak political position that the United Kingdom government is currently in. I mean, you know, when I was advocating this case to David Cameron and George Osborne, you know, I didn't agree with them. I don't think David Cameron was Einstein, but at least he looked like a prime minister. I mean, they were political giants compared to what you're operating against now. So the first thing should be done is to implement the 4 mandates that we have already. And then, you know, this tend to say, oh, we'll go off to the Supreme Court. Well, you know, as we probably all agree, the Supreme Court is a Hail Mary pass at best. You know, it's a big outsider. You know, I like betting a horse or 2 occasionally, and you know, everybody likes a 33, 50, 100 to 1 shot that comes in, but you know, they don't often come in. That's why they're noted, and it's that sort of proximity, I would reckon, on the Supreme Court. So we'll jump in, then we jump in, oh, if we get beaten in the Supreme Court, then we go to a plebiscite election. You know, the important thing in politics is to maximise the opportunities you've got before you think of something else. Now, it's important to have a strategy, certainly, but make sure it's a strategy that's going to work. If you're going in for a plebiscite election, you should go in for it in a way it can work. All ALBA can do is put it forward what everybody knows is sensible. As I say, not just because you want to group the entire national movement behind you, not just because you want to concentrate the issue on Scottish independence, but because you don't want to fight the election on the SNP Green record in Holyrood. I mean, if you're fighting an independence election, the last thing you want to do is fight it on the record of the SNP Green administration at the present moment, because, you know, and I mean, obviously, it's not as bad as the unionist press make out to be, but I mean, clearly there are a number of weaknesses within it. Which, you know, if any fair-minded person would see. So you want to fight it on the issue and potential of Scottish independence, not on party politics. And therefore, that would be to me, the principal argument for having the Scotland United framework. But in terms of your question of James, what can we do? Well, we can put forward what is sensible, right, progressive and just for Scotland, and hope that other people are going to listen. Next, the point, you know, and this is an important question, much more important in many ways. It doesn't get you off the hook in how you deliver on a mandate. I mean, the UK parties are not going to accept the concept of a plebiscite election. It undoubtedly strengthens your hand if you're successful in the way of arguing for independence, but you then have to say what you're going to do about it. What are you going to do on the far side of the plebiscite election if the people back you? You then are faced with a similar situation to what hasn't been done with 4 mandates already to get a referendum. You have to find your political method of forcing the democratic will of the Scottish people on an unwilling United Kingdom government. And you know, at some point, there's no way around that. People have to accept their responsibilities on what they stood for election. You can't keep pretending to people that you're going to stop this or start this or ensure this. You know, at some point, people see through that. You've got to accept your responsibility as elected members.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
The next one with her hand up, Alison.
Hi. Hi, I'm in not so sunny Shropshire in England today. So I do have a question around women's rights, and it is starting to really concern me that you see it in WhatsApp chats, and you see it in Twitter, and you see it in private Twitter groups, that you know, women who are in favour of independence are starting to question whether or not that what will that lead to, because it seems at the moment that the only thing that is stopping the current SNP Green government from the whole-scale introduction of gender identity theory is the UK Equality Act. And a lot of us are worried that, you know, the first thing any independence government could do is, if it's a current government, would be to ditch the Equality Act and adopt gender ideology. And you only have to look at what's happening in Ireland with women's rights to know how it could absolutely come true. And it could actually make the difference. I think I saw a poll recently that said that, there's women are the proportion of women who are in favour of independence is going down. So and if I was, if we're having an indie referendum campaign, if I was a unionist, I would definitely make that a point of contention, because it's a great strategy to do that. So how do we get people on side, women on side, to say that yes, we want we will vote yes in an indie ref?
It's a very fair question. Obviously, it does underline the importance of having a party like ALBA, or the ISP for that matter, who take a different view and don't think it's a great idea for the issue of identity politics to be progressed in the way it's being progressed by the SNP and the Greens. Of course, there are lots of people, I suspect, in the SNP who share that opinion as well, but they're not, it seems, in a great position to express it. And of course, there are certain exceptions to that. I mean, Joanna Cherry, for example, has been very vocal and very effective on this issue. But if we look at this in two ways. I mean, ALBA's position on this is well known, and remember, of course, that there have been some significant court victories in favour of that position in recent weeks. And that position, it seems to me, is very important that we progress and demonstrate that that everybody who supports independence is not in favour of the current SNP Green government line on this. On the contrary, I suspect, in terms of public opinion, a very substantial majority of the public are not in favour of the SNP and Green government's line on the matter. So we'll continue to defend women's rights as we've done. We'll look for support from other fellow-minded people. But in terms of independence strategy, the key complaint about this is when you're trying to achieve independence for a nation, then you shouldn't be dividing opinion in the national movement. Your job is to unite opinion. Now, obviously, issues will come up where you've got to take sides, but I mean, identity politics seems a very strange preoccupation for those who are trying to achieve independence. Maybe the best thing to do, of course, is to make sure, because there is general agreement in the independence movement that Scotland should have a written constitution, and it might seem to me that a constitutional protection of women's rights would be a good thing to advocate, since it certainly would be the matter, which would give it protection which goes beyond the circumstances of whichever government happens to be in power, and would enshrine it as it should be enshrined as part of the women's rights, as part of human rights in terms of a constitution. But I think it does illustrate, for the point that we were making a wee bit earlier, that there is a great advantage if the issue of independence is being brought to the touch, either in a referendum or in a plebiscite election or in any other way, that it's made clear that you can support the cause of independence from a variety of positions, and the independence itself should not be dominated by identity politics in the way that you see the danger of it being, which all underlines the importance of ALBA's existence as part of the independence coalition.
Yeah. There's a Scottish rally, feminist rally, on the 15th. So I'm going to it in Edinburgh. But it'd be good if there was some other people from ALBA there as well, to say that we're here and we support women's rights. So is there any?
Well, the rallies haven't lacked ALBA participation, as you're well aware, and Eva Comrie, as our equalities and women's convener, is one of the the most dedicated and effective, let me say, attenders at demonstrations that I've ever witnessed in politics. The woman has a boundless energy. She is, in every sense, a bionic woman. I mean, she's fantastic, and I'm quite certain that that's the sort of a demonstration that Eva will be representing, or nominate somebody else to do at ALBA.
Thank you. Yeah, she's fantastic. Thank you.
We've seen a couple of more people coming in. If you have a question for Alex, please press the reaction button and press the raise hands button so I'll know that you have a question. Gordon.
Hi, I'm also in London. And what bothers me is the SNP membership. The SNP is still the major political organisation in Scotland, but it seems to me that over the last few years, my impression is that there has been a shift in the membership from focusing on independence to focusing on being the largest party in Scotland, and also a focus on party loyalty above everything else. I mean, my enforced departure from the SNP was driven entirely by arguments about independence versus loyalty to the party. There were people who agreed with me about various things that were happening, gerrymandering candidates, things like that. But the view was, oh, but that's the SNP. You're a member of the SNP. You have to support this. Now, my knowledge of SNP people is pretty much is limited, I guess, to London and Edinburgh. So I'd like to know, do you think I'm right about this change in emphasis in the membership as a whole? And is it an issue? How do we change minds? Is wheesht for Indies still a big problem?
Well, I think you go back to the reasons for ALBA being formed. I mean, the principal reason for ALBA being formed was dissatisfaction about the SNP's intent or willingness to progress the independence case and the 4 mandates that they have to for an independence referendum. I mean, that was, and then secondly, the great concern about women's rights, as we've just heard. And thirdly, I suspect concern about the internal democracy or lack of it in the SNP. But the overriding, I mean, that's to cast things in a negative light. The overriding reason for ALBA is we believe it will progress the case for independence. And I suppose, if you take a long sweep of things, I mentioned I was speaking in Catalonia a couple of weeks back, and I encourage people there because they're in a fairly despondent mood because their independence strategy hit a brick wall, and there's a lot of recriminations in the movement in Catalonia about what they did and what they didn't do, and looking for a new way forward. And what I encouraged them to do, and looking at Scotland, Ireland, and Catalonia, which was the subject of my address, was to look at the sweep of history. I mean, 100 years ago, Ireland still had a colonial administration, was still a lieutenant governor. Had been since virtually the Norman Conquest. 50 years ago, Catalonia was still under the heel of fascist repression, and 25 years ago, Scotland. It was the Scottish government was composed of a party which went on to have no seats at all in the 1997 election, in the Tory quasi-colonial administration of St Andrew's House in the 1990s. So, in contrast to that, I mean, Ireland is independent, albeit partitioned, but the unity in Ireland is probably. Irish unity is probably nearer than any point in our lifetimes. Certainly the most closest for 100 years, absolutely. Catalonia is autonomous, albeit having failed their enterprise thus far. But they have an autonomous government, and Scotland has a devolution in the Scottish Parliament, which most people in Scotland think should be taking the decisions as regards to Scotland, even though it doesn't. So, if you look at the kind of sweep of history, all these national movements have made progress, substantial progress. And basically what we're talking about is how do you get over the line to become a fully fledged member of the community of nations. So I look on the ALBA a bit like when I led the SNP for the first time, when we had 4 MPs and we were a small party, with a membership roughly the same as ALBA is now, actually. And we had 2 roles. I mean, one, myself and Jim Sowers and Alec Neo and a number of other people thought, we've got a strategy. If we can position the SNP in the political spectrum in a way that hadn't really done before on the left of centre, we can build up a long-term credibility and at some point replace the Labour Party in Scotland and gain a Scottish Parliament, become the majority party in that Parliament and move to independence. That was our strategy. I mean, it would take a long time. It actually occurred rather quicker than many of us thought it would. But that was a strategy which we're working for. But in the 1990s, we also knew we had another role, that we knew that any success that we had, any success, would have an immediate impact on the Labour Party as they moved to protect their flank. So when Jim Sowers won govern in 1988, the Labour Party suddenly discovers its enthusiasm for the Scottish Parliament, which had lain virtually dormant since the Second World War. So the SNP at that stage acted both as a party with a long-term plan to achieve independence and as a party with a short-term role as providing the political pressure. The Labour Party were running on the SNP's petrol, and now I would say that the SNP are running on ALBA's wind power. The ALBA has that role. And we have to make ALBA successful. The contribution we make to thought we've already been doing for the Wee ALBA book. The contribution we make by making constructive contributions as to how you should achieve independence is important, as are the other organisations who are putting it forward at the present moment. But the political contribution of providing that political incentive for the major party of independence to do what it was elected and mandated to do is of enormous importance. If we thought a year ago or so when ALBA was formed that it was possible to do that from within the SNP, then no doubt that's the route that people would have chosen. But just because you can't do it from within the SNP doesn't mean it can't be done. And the key aspect of this is absolutely certain. I mean, what drives the independence movement is not the wish to provide seats and sinecures and political advisors and spads and comfortable, cosy jobs for hundreds of people around the Scottish National Party. What drives the support is the belief and wish of people to obtain independence. And ultimately, the SNP have got a choice. They either deliver what they were elected to do, or at some point, people will say, you're not doing it, so we'll get somebody else to do it. And there have been, as we all know, plenty of examples in history of massive political movements once people decided that their chosen majority party weren't going to do what they were meant to do. I mean, the Irish Parliamentary Party ruled the roost in Irish politics for the best part of 40 years and more. Dominant, totally dominant. And in one single election, they were swept away because people decided that they weren't able to deliver what they'd been sent to Westminster to deliver and wanted to embark on another process. So big changes can happen in politics. I'm hoping that our constructive contribution, plus the political threat, maybe a long-term one, but a significant political threat that ALBA can pose in terms of claiming the independence vote, will persuade those who've got the mandate to exercise it and to use it and to think about the strategy of how you obtain independence from an unwilling Westminster government. I mean, nobody should be surprised. I often say, get quite interested when people say, well, why doesn't Westminster just, accept the democratic vote, accept the mandate, do the gentlemanly thing and say, well done, chaps, you won the election, you're entitled to your referendum. Westminster never does that. I mean, they've been dealing in the Westminster system with with annoying national movements for generations, for centuries. They've never done that. They only do it, agree to it, when they're politically in a position that it's worse for them not to agree to it. And that's the position you've got to put them in. Now, I had some advantages when I had the responsibility of fulfilling a mandate that I'd been in Westminster for 25 years. I knew how they think, how they work, what they do, what they don't do, what consideration they give, and what pushes their buttons and what doesn't. So that was an advantage for me. But one way or another, you have to realize it's a political argument that you're trying to force on an unwilling state. And ALBA's role in it, I think, is highly significant. And if we were to rely just on internal democratization or re-democratization of the SNP, we might be waiting a considerable time. I think the ALBA's role is significant in enforcing the changes that are necessary to get forward to independence.
Thank you. Next one, Sandy. First unmute. Yeah, there you go.
Yep. Hi. Right. I think there was sort of two slightly different aspects to what I was going to ask, and I think Alex has just answered one of them anyway, which was maybe at some time we've got to supplant the current people within the SNP, either with different people from within the SNP or from a different party, supplanting what's there just now, because they don't seem to be pushing ahead in the direction which certainly the ALBA members would like to see them going, and probably a wider independent supporting movement would like to see them going. But the other thing I wanted to touch on in that was how you think ALBA might be able to do that. I forgot to mention, I'm currently down in Cheshire, but I'm just back from Scotland. And when I was up in Scotland, I met up with some old friends and relatives. We chatted about many things and occasionally chatted about independence and politics. And one of the things that struck me, I mean, one of my friends who I thought was reasonably with it, for example, didn't know that all these meetings that you're having at the moment, Alex, were going on. He knew nothing about them. Okay, his view was that basically ALBA had tried something. They've been trying to get through in the Holyrood elections, trying to make the case in the council elections, had failed, hadn't made the breakthrough, and so ALBA was irrelevant. That was his view. So part of that I can see is coming from the message being put out by the SNP government, and some of it's coming out through the mainstream media. So my question is, how do you overcome that and get ALBA into a position where potentially, if it's required, it would supplant the SNP as the leading party in Scotland?
Well, Sandy, I mean, ALBA is 16 months old. You know, it's and you know, has 6,000 members and you know, has built a political party in that 16 months. Nobody, I mean, the history of political parties formation should tell you that this is not an easy process. You know, it just doesn't happen easily, I'm afraid. Mostly, incidentally, through recognition factors. I mean, the vast majority of people in Scotland don't really know who ALBA is because they haven't had enough exposure to ALBA and ALBA arguments. And there is no shortcut to getting that, Sandy. You just have to keep hammering away. You know, I've never been the one for instant political success. I mean, you know, as I say, when I became leader of the SNP in 1990, I had 4 MPs. And in the previous election, I think I had 14% of the vote, which was an improvement from the 11% of the election before that. You know, so you know, I don't mind undertaking the task of helping to turn small parties into big ones. You know, I've done it before. But I know that it's not something you can do overnight. It's not something you can do in 14 months. But part of the exposure you need, of course, is to stand in elections. That's what political parties do. And you mustn't expect immediate success. You don't get it. In terms of people knowing about the meetings, apart from all the meetings being packed out, I mean, I think I'm right in saying a clip from the Sky meeting from last Saturday, you know, a short clip got 30,000 views, unique views. On the social media. So, you know, obviously your friend wasn't among the 30,000. But
Yeah, he's not totally computer savvy. So
well, obviously,
and that's part of
if you're relying on the mainstream media to report the ALBA meetings, or for that matter, as was mentioned by the chair, the salvo demonstration of a few days ago, and Neil Handy's excellent speech and other excellent speeches at that. I mean, if we're relying on the mainstream media for reporting, God help us all.
But unfortunately, an awful lot of people in Scotland are still relying on the mainstream media, and I think my question was, how do you overcome the fact that they're relying on that? And I accept what you say about. I mean, you mentioned in the previous answer how you built up the SNP. I accept that, but when we're facing a position where it might have to be, let's hope in the next 2 years that we're looking for some sort of way to secure independence in the next couple of years, you haven't got that length of time. So there is, I think, an urgency being felt amongst people at the moment who are supporting independence to move on as quickly as possible.
Indeed, which is what ALBA are arguing for.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's arguable, incidentally, if it wasn't for ALBA, there'd be no independent strategy announced at all.
I agree. Yeah.
I mean, there hasn't been one for the last 8 years. I see no particular reason why suddenly 2022 should be the date of announcement of a strategy. So look,
I think the point of that, I think, is obviously the SNP are aware of ALBA. Well, my question is, how do you make the general public aware?
Which we should welcome, Sandy.
Yeah. Oh yes, I do.
Look, none of us here are in this because we want a position in politics, or we want ALBA to be the only party in the firmament. We want to have all the accoutrements of political success. We're here on this call. The people attending the meetings are ordinary folk who want to see independence for their country. That's our objective, right? We don't have any other agenda apart from trying to achieve independence and make a constructive contribution to it. I think we've made a constructive contribution in the Wee ALBA book. I mean, incidentally, talking about copying stuff, there's been a number of SNP publications in the last few weeks which look to me like a straight copy from bits of the Wee ALBA book. So, I'm pleased that Mr. McAlpine, who was the main author of the Wee ALBA book, has managed single-handed to supply some of the work that the legions and hundreds of special advisors and researchers in the SNP hadn't managed to do for some time. But look, again, that's a contribution, and it's a substantial contribution. I mean, there haven't been many publications on Scottish independence that had 100,000 distributed in a space of a few months, with hopefully another 100,000 of the second edition. But being able to answer questions that people are asking, as opposed to running away from them. I mean, the SNP spokespeople have been running like frightened rabbits from the question of borders for the last 4 years. It's almost agonizing. I've watched the, SNP MPs who presumably have some background in training in politics. They're asked a question by an interviewer, and you can see the panic in their face. How do I answer this question? Well, now they can read the Wee ALBA book, and even if we supply a late education course for people who become, by some mischance, elected to Parliament, then that's a role and a contribution. But much more so for giving people who are interested in independence the firepower and the confidence that comes from knowledge. And therefore the Wee ALBA book and Robin's contribution and others to it are of great importance. But to actually, so the role of ALBA as pressurising those who have got the responsibility is a significant one. These meetings are significant. The Yestival on the 18th September is significant. The ALBA conference is significant. In terms of ALBA's own political success, well, we just keep knocking at the door. The only way a political party can obtain profile is to get success in an election. The local elections, we didn't elect any councillors, but as you probably all know, there's an analysis which shows we were actually very strong in preference votes. Now, unfortunately, in a local election, when your preferences, we had an example here locally where Brian Topping would have been elected on the first ballots, and would have been elected if the SNP preferences had got down to him. But unfortunately, the SNP only got to the quota and so the preferences were never reallocated or allocated at a value of virtually nothing. So there's plenty of examples like that. Now, why is that relevant? Well, you know, a local election doesn't matter if your preferences don't get to you, but they will definitely get to you in the Scottish parliamentary election through the list vote. That's when that would be really, really important. And it's important also because it does indicate that the people prepared to vote for ALBA, if you take second and third preferences as indicating I would vote for them under certain circumstances, is a growing number, certainly growing large enough to record parliamentary representation in the Scottish election. So that's of interest. But there is only one way to get to political credibility, and that's to keep knocking at the door and key opportunities, whether it be local by-elections, the general election, where we've got 2 MPs at the present moment are looking to be part of an independence alliance, and the Scottish elections beyond that. I mean, you know, it's not a short-term game, it's a long-term game. But our role in the urgency of independence is our impact on the Scottish political scene. And just like I had to accept that we weren't going to replace the Labour Party overnight in the 1990s, I have to accept that we're not going to replace the SNP overnight in 2022. What we can do overnight is provide the political pressure, which means other people who've been charged with responsibility can't avoid that responsibility for much longer. And therefore, what we've got to say about things like the campaign that should be now in terms of forcing a Section 30, what we say about the Supreme Court, I think is quite important as well. I mean, you wouldn't want all Scotland's eggs to be in the Supreme Court basket. That strikes me as a recipe for disaster. And thirdly, what we say about a Scotland United approach to general election is also of immediate importance, as well as that longer term aspiration. But you know, after 16 months, I think the efforts of ALBA and the people within it have been considerable, and not least of which ALBA International, and finding a key role for broadcasting the Scotland's case to an international audience.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. Bill.
Hi guys, I hope you don't mind if I leave my camera off. You catch me in the middle of making a bunch of food in the kitchen. Alex,
No,
you mentioned the Catalonia situation. And that's one of my concerns. How do we avoid ending up in the same situation as Catalonia, where they sent in the Guardia Civil, bully boy thugs, to disrupt the elections, beat people up, and then declared the result irrelevant?
Well, I don't want to, reanalyze. And when I made the speeches I made in Catalonia, I deliberately tried not to criticize or attack or apparently appearing to know better than anybody else about the Catalonian situation. So let's look at Catalonia first. What I would say generally about Catalonia is once you embark on a certain course of action, as the Catalonian politicians did, then you have to carry through with it. You can't abandon it halfway. You can't sort of say, well, we'll declare, we've had a referendum, the Spanish police have knocked lots of old ladies over the head and behaved disgracefully in the court of international opinion. We'll now have a unilateral declaration of independence, but incidentally, we'll delay it for 2 months until we can negotiate with the Spanish state. Now, that doesn't appear to me, it may be people might argue they should have adopted a different strategy. But once you've adopted something, you've got to go through with it. There's a quote from Churchill, which is quite relevant here. He said it about Suez and his successor, Anthony Eden. And he was asked about Suez, and he said, well, I never would have started it. But having started it, I would have finished it. So, one lesson from the Catalonian experience would be that once you embark on a certain course of action, you've got to carry through with it. You can't abandon it halfway and say, oops, we're uncertain as to where to go. Secondly, you ask about how you avoid that in Scotland. Well, let's be realistic here. Spain has had 2 periods of fascism in the 20th century. and the second period of, even more repressive than the first, the Franco period. The Spanish state is configured in a way which is quite different from the United Kingdom, and what governments of Spain believe they can do is quite different from what governments of the United Kingdom believe they can do. The instruments of state power that we have in Scotland are not inconsiderable if you want to use them. I mean, there was a reason why David Cameron decided to go forward with a Section 30, as opposed to allowing or waiting for me to go forward with legislation in the Scots Parliament. His reading of the situation, I mean, he was frightened that I would find a way to have a Scottish referendum and win it, regardless of what happened in Westminster. He thought I was going to have a three-way referendum, which would, I won't go into the detail of it, but look, there was a reason for that. And that's about the balance of power. Of course, Westminster has great things in its favour in terms of state power, but it's also a state and a government in crisis at the present moment. And here's the thing. One of Westminster, as opposed to in Spain, where the rest of Spain, probably out with the Basque Country at least, would be cheating on the Spanish police and their tactics by and large. One of the differences is there's a significant body of opinion in English society who don't say, oh, right, the best way to deal with Scotland is to refuse to let them have a referendum. There's a significant body of opinion say, well, if that's what the Scots want, that's what they should do. There's even a body of opinion that says, well, we better short them anyway. So, a government in Westminster acting in a Spanish direction, let's put it that way, it would not have the people of England at their backs. On the contrary, the people of England would probably be trying to kick them out at that present moment. So that's about the balance. All we can do as a national movement in Scotland, incidentally, and this is where I salute the Catalonian movement, is dedicate ourselves to peaceful action, to peaceful protest, and the understanding that broken promises are never worth broken heads. So we dedicate ourselves to constitutionalism and to find political methods of progressing our case. But we shouldn't, when we devote ourselves to constitutionalism, that doesn't mean you have to imprison yourself. There's for those of you who've got long experience, and incidentally, can I commend everybody to read Owen Deadly Edwards' book on Our Nations and Nationalism, just published, because I thought I knew. I mean, I wrote the foreword, incidentally, but I thought I knew most things about Scottish nationalism, but after reading Owen's book, I realised there was one or two things I hadn't realised and hadn't known about. So if any of you haven't read it, then get hold of it, because it's also selling like hot cakes at the ALBA book meetings around the country, incidentally, Owen's book. So there's an aspect of when you understand the Scottish history, then you don't confine yourself, because you might remember the famous Turnbull cartoon. Turnbull was the cartoonist for the Herald, the Glasgow Herald as it was there. And he once in 1979, in the aftermath of the failed devolution referendum, he had this very famous cartoon of what was called the Fiat Lion. And this was this lion, this majestic animal, cowering in the back of his cage, which had an open door. And it was a great, for many of us, it was a great symbol of the Scottish psyche. And we mustn't get ourselves into the mentality of Turnbull's lion. We have many political maneuvers and mechanisms at our disposal, not least of which is this very substantial wish and desire and sentiment of a politically active and activated population. With many areas at our disposal. And if you get yourself into a psychology that we can only do things if we have Westminster's permission, then I'm afraid you're on a route to nowhere. The task of the national movement is now, as it always has been, is to find a way to get that Scottish desire and sentiment and democracy imposed on our the politics of Westminster. And I think there are so many ways to do it this now. I mean, look, back in, as First Minister, I had one mandate, one. to have an independence referendum. We had 6 MPs at Westminster. There was a coalition government we were facing, which had its own tensions, but had a big majority and was led by a competent prime minister and a clever, not a very nice person in my estimation, but a clever and shrewd Chancellor of the Exchequer, who were running the government, right? And yet we got to a referendum in 2014. In comparison with what is faced now of a state in crisis, of a government which is about to be led, I mean, Liz Truss, there's always, it's a bit like the Supreme Court case, there's always 100 to 1 shot, but if Liz Truss is going to emerge as an outstanding prime minister, it'll be one of the greatest transformations I've ever seen in politics. There's nothing, absolutely nothing about her career or about her exposition of her case which indicates she's got the slightest capability of answering the point of crisis. We can all be surprised, incidentally, but there's nothing in it now. So we have a state which is in a fundamental state of weakness. That strikes me, to use the old Irish phrase, that Westminster's difficulties are Scotland's opportunity.
All right, Peter, before I come to you, there's a question on the chat that I wanted to put forth, otherwise I'm going to forget it. Where do we? Yeah, there we go. It's from Isabel. The Wee ALBA roadshows have been packed out all around the country. Can I ask if there has been an opportunity for people to sign up to membership of ALBA on leaving these meetings? A membership boost could encourage others to join.
Yes, there has, and if I can give a compliment, I mean, there's been many people involved, obviously, in the meetings, but Denise Finlay's role and the efforts in this matter and the team of people she's gathered behind her have been absolutely superb. And you do get an opportunity, not necessarily the first few meetings, because we were just learning as we went along, but now, it's all run in such a way as people can flash their mobile phone and get all the information they require. And we know, for example, that about 60% of people attending are not ALBA members, on average, sometimes slightly more, which is really interesting. And we know that people join after the meetings. So yes, it's a straight answer. But the more we do this, the better. I mean, there's no substitute for work rate and profile in terms of getting people and recruiting. I think able people. And one thing that's impressed me is the nature and style of the questioning at the meetings. We're talking to a highly activated and informed audience. It's really interesting. And as I say, people just looking for a sense of direction and a viable independent strategy, and wanting to express, universally. If we'd had a vote at any of these meetings, do you think going to the Supreme Court is a good idea? I don't think many hands would have gone up, So there's a real understanding of many of the issues involved, and it's a pleasure to do them, incidentally, because I'm not the only one doing them. I mean, Neil and Kenny and others have been doing the meetings as well. I think I've done 35 or something like that, but there's other meetings as well, and there's a range of meetings coming up in September. You'll find them all in the ALBA page of upcoming events, just in case any of the meetings collide with your visits back to the home country.
Thank you. Peter, your question.
Yeah, hello, Alex. Thanks for turning up today. A brief question about international recognition that came to me. 2014 and the Catalan referendum really showed that, to me at least, that there wasn't a great deal. There weren't many gallant allies in Europe, to put it that way. I'd like to hear your thoughts on reaching out to the BRICS nations. I mean, we very much represent the Western world, but the Western world apparently is only 15% of the world population. Only 1/3 of the countries, United Nations, are supporting what's going on, are international. Should we be reaching out to the rest of the world in a greater way? Do we have that preparation?
Right. Well, ALBA and ALBA International, of course, are engaged in that at the present moment, and you know, that's a real key role for ALBA International, because people in various countries, you know, have contacts and can arrange meetings and so on and so forth. And you know, that's I think going to be a significant help to us, because obviously we don't have an army of paid employees to do it. Therefore, the ALBA International people from around the globe using their contacts can help us enormously in that. But on the Catalonia situation, it's very interesting. You know, the Catalonia didn't really achieve the support they should have had. I mean, the Belgian Prime Minister at the time, and also the acting chair, incidentally, was a Tory MP of Roger Gale of the Council of Europe, made a statement, a plenary session, attacking the behaviour of the Spanish state, which is quite, and hardly got reported, of course, but it was quite significant. But with that apart, you're quite right, they got no effective states support. And obviously, you know, we had limited support in 2014. Our best efforts were neutralising David Cameron's efforts to gain, you know, beg enemy. I mean, Cameron was, you know, in the last week or two, Cameron was, I mean, he was on the phone to the Queen, of course, but he was on the phone all in sundry. You know, he phoned, well, you know, he, as well known, he contacted President Putin to gain support to David Cameron. He also, he was successful only in two people, two heads of state or prime ministers came to his aid. One was Barack Obama, incidentally. Although the statement was pretty mild. I mean, the next day I was with John Kerry at the D-Day commemorations, and John Kerry being the Secretary of State then, and I said to, I opened up by telling John Kerry I was going to expel him from the Scottish caucus in the Senate. And he said, why? I said, but because the president's statement on Scottish independence. He said, yeah, he said, that was the least we could do. because Cameron was on the phone all the time begging for support. So it was a kind of de minimis statement. He got Cameron also got the bum's rush from Angela Merkel when he tried to get her to intervene. So we did not bad. I mean, the most success, the biggest success was in President Barroso, you know, who, for one reason or another, believed that the UK was going to make him Secretary General in NATO. So, didn't, of course. They appointed a former Norwegian unilateralist instead. But Barroso wasn't very helpful at all, because well, he was Barroso. But you know, again, if you look at the situation in 2014, I mean, the UK was a loyal-ish member of the European Union. So obviously it was quite difficult, although there was lots of sympathy, you know, and for Scotland's case and among European Union members, etc., etc. But the European Union are not going to gainsay a member state. That was part of Catalonia's difficulty, of course. Spain was a loyal member of the European Union. In terms of Europe, we're in a totally different situation now, because I mean, the UK is in the middle, and looks like the new Prime Minister is going to continue with the breach of international law and the Irish Protocol, which is not, you know, once you take the Ukrainian conflict off the table, it's certainly not enamoring itself to European Union, other European Union members. I mean, this is a fairly fundamental thing. You know, you make an agreement, sign a treaty, and then breach it. You know, you know, that's quite redolent with opportunity in terms of the European angle. In terms of the rest of the world, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we've got to cast our net as wide as we possibly can. I was going to say that the only other success that Cameron had internationally was with Tony Abbott, who was then the Australian Prime Minister. If you remember, Abbott made an intervention saying that the forces of darkness, I think I'm right in saying, he said the forces of darkness were all cheering on Scottish independence. I met a bunch of Australian Scots, incidentally, in the campaign trail, who told me they were forming an organisation called ABA, Anybody But Abbott, when they got back to Australia, to make sure he got imminent demise as Prime Minister. And of course, about a year or two later, that happened. And interestingly enough, the guy that succeeded him in the Liberal caucus was Turnbull. which I don't know about Turnbull's antecedents, but clearly a Scottish name. So I would think I think perhaps they had the desired effect. But look, the serious point is, yes, we mustn't just cast our net, and Europe must cast wide, but we've got certain priorities. In terms of the Wee ALBA book and our strategy for international engagement, the EFTA countries are a key priority for us because the arguments in the book which indicate we should be setting our cap to EFTA at the present moment for all sorts of reasons. So that's a key priority. Other European Union members are a key priority. The preparation of an international legal case is a key priority for ALBA. That's been done by others as well, but we must help with these efforts because the more people behind such a case, the better, because it looks like it's going to be necessary at some point. And obviously the range of countries where the Scottish imprint has been felt worldwide. I mean, without blowing smoke up our own nether regions, I would say that Scotland, probably has advantages over Catalonia in terms of international reach. And we've got to use these advantages because Scots worldwide, you may remember when I was First Minister, I had this Global Scots organisation, which wasn't so much about politics, more about economics and investment opportunities and all the rest of it. But, it was a recognition that the Scottish family internationally is a really important asset for the country. And it's a really important asset for progressing the case for Scottish independence as well.
Thank you. Sarah, she's gone away for a bit, but there she is. You're muted, Sarah. There you go.
Hi, thank you very much. I was just quickly coming back to sovereignty. Of course, that's not actually transferable from the people to government, but it is loaned to elected representatives by the people, and the condition of that loan being that those representatives reflect the will of those who elected them and uphold the interests, the common good of the nation. So at present, we can count on the fingers of one hand the representatives fulfilling the condition of that loan, Neil and Kenny being the standouts. So given the blockade by our elected representatives of the national will and of our interests, by the vast majority of our elected MPs and MSPs, it's clearly the case that their legitimacy under the Scottish Constitution is at the very least in question. So that we're now needing to find a way whereby the will of the people finds expression through a coordinated campaign to assert our desire for self-determination internationally and in concert with the legitimate, genuinely representative MPs that we have. So, clearly, I assume people are aware that what Salvo and the SSRG and this Council for the Congress are going to be doing, which is effectively establishing a voice for people who have been disenfranchised by those who were loaned this power, loaned this the faith and the will of the people. And what my question is how can you see a way that we can work in concert with our MPs, our representatives who are in fact expressing the sovereignty, the will of the people who have loaned them that sovereignty, to take it forward and take it forward internationally? It's clearly the notion of a concerted and well-organized move is going to become more and more crucial very quickly, I think.
Well, Sarah, obviously you're well versed on these things, as we both know. The solution to this is within the Declaration of Arbroath. When the community of the realm, addressing Pope John the 22nd, explain why good King Robert is King of Scots, and it also goes on to explain what would happen to good King Robert if he emerged as a betrayer of their rights, that they would drive him from office and get somebody else. That's the essence of the claim that the Declaration of Arbroath is the first European enunciation of the doctrine of popular sovereignty. And it's a very substantial claim. And that was true in 1320. It's true in 2022. that what you do is, if those who are vested with the wish of the community of the realm, the sovereignty of the people, if they don't discharge their responsibilities, you get somebody else.
Yeah.
And you do that by the process of politics and election. Now, I'm in favour of this, as I describe it, this golden thread of Scottish history stretching back to the 14th century, and I also think it should be brought right up to date, because let's remember that every Scottish MP in the 1980s, late 80s, with the exception, I think I'm right in saying, of Brian Wilson and Tam Dael, signed up to the claim of right. Yeah. And that, of course, was a parliamentary motion which was put forward by the SNP group more recently on the claim of right. So let's include these recent examples as well. This is not just a history lesson. This is very much the importance of the relevant current day politics. I mean, when the Declaration of Arbroath mused for paragraphs about the origins of the Scots, they weren't doing it just for a history lesson to Pope John the 22nd. They were doing it to assert a prior claim over the land of Scotland than the English had. That's why all the stuffs about the Trojans and the Greeks and all the rest of it, that's why it was there. It was there for political reasons. So, when we have the engagement, as you've done so well, in terms of Scottish history and that golden thread of sovereignty, you're doing it for political reasons for the present day, just as in 1320 they were doing it for practical political reasons of that day. So I think it's helpful to have groups enunciating this case. It's helpful to have citizens' participation in it. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the elected representatives, not because they own the sovereignty, but because they are custodians. You're right, they don't have any arbitrary authority over it. It's bestowed upon them by the people who have that sovereignty, the community of the realm, the people of the nation. But if they don't discharge it, then you have to replace them with other people who will discharge it. Incidentally, I don't think, you say a handful. Incidentally, under different leadership, it would only be a handful that resisted it. Yeah. Unfortunately, in life and politics, and certainly within parliamentary groups, there are a lot of people just follow the line, basically. If the line from above is no action, they advocate no action. If the line from above became action, they'd suddenly become great advocates of action. I think obviously it doesn't do, it does, well, let's put it the other way around because it sounds better. It does great credit to those like Joe Cherry, who are willing to put themselves in the firing line because they want to see, or Angus MacNeil for that matter, who want to see, or Douglas Chapman, who want to see more assertive action, and risking being told off by the might of the SNP chief whip at Westminster, or whatever dreadful thing might happen to them. It does them great credit, and it does others less credit that they're not prepared to do so. But I don't think, Sarah, it would require that much in terms of agitation or to change that situation. But one ingredient rather goes back to what I was asked earlier. One ingredient is, of course, to have the threat of political success from ALBA, or another party for that matter, but ALBA certainly is the best runner at the present moment. That would concentrate minds wonderfully. It really would. And all of a sudden, you'd have all these parliamentarians being key advocates of all the things. I'm sure that the history lesson that's coming from Salvo and from the Sovereignty Group is of great use. Incidentally, I spent a lot of time in SNP meetings trying to explain to people the importance of history, not because it's history, but because it informs what you do now and in the future.
Well, you probably know that we're hoping to produce enough of a movement to make a representation internationally under the United Nations condition.
Agreed, but remember, Sarah, the first question you'll be asked by any international authority, and these things have a long history, as you're well aware. I'm old enough to remember the Scotland UN Committee and the various. And incidentally, when I made the speech in Catalonia, right, I discovered, and maybe other people knew about it, but I didn't. But I did discover the Catalonian Appeal to the United Nations of 1945, which was brilliant. and a brilliant document. Because, you know, if you think about 1945, the situation, the Catalonians were wanting the Allies to continue the war into Spain, to unseat the fascist dictatorship, because it was, after all, a war against fascism. And there'd been many Catalonian volunteers on the Allied side, etc. The Catalonian head of state, of course, had been murdered by Franco when he was repatriated from Vichy France. And they produced the Catalonian committee. And remember, they produced a claim to the United Nations in San Francisco in the formation. But one of the questions that they were asked immediately is, you know, what's your legitimacy? And they spent a lot of time saying, well, we represent this group and that group and the next group. And of course, it was a brilliant document, absolutely. And incidentally, if history had been different, if there hadn't been the division of the world into the Soviet Union, the West, etc., and the priority became the defeat of communism, they might have succeeded, incidentally. But history was as it was. But there's no getting around. I mean, the pressure is very important. The articulation is very important, Sarah. But there's no getting around the fact you'll be asked, who are the parliamentary representation? Who are the MSPs? Who are the MPs? Now, to have some of them on board is really important.
Yeah.
The solution is to get the majority on board. That's the question. That's how it's done politically. But, you know, more strength to your elbow. You'll get every encouragement from me.
Thank you.
All right, before I get to Maggie, we have another question on the chat by James Carson, also in the meeting. With Big Pharma behind self-ID, the energy companies' massive ripoff, lack of a census, the mention of free ports and charter cities, are the big corporations a problem for Scotland's independence?
Well, I think they're a problem for everyone. I mean, if you get the sort of, you know, casino capitalism, which we're in at the present moment, you know, if you get a natural resource shortages, then what often happens is that big corporates enrich themselves, take the opportunity to enrich themselves at the expense of everybody else, which is what's happening. Now, incidentally, a good example of this, I support a price freeze on energy bills at the present moment. I think any government should be engaging in this. But the proposal from some of the energy companies is to have a price freeze and the public will pay for it, you know, not through the bills, but through taxation. So the last thing that will happen is the energy companies will be expected to make a contribution. No, you should have a price freeze, and the energy companies should make a contribution. And if they're not prepared to make a contribution, then they should be nationalised, because, you know, the producers of energy are vastly enriching themselves at the expense of everybody else. You know, and therefore you need a government prepared to do something about it. So it is a problem for everyone. It's also an opportunity, of course. I mean, let's take some. I mean, Boris Johnson, I don't know if many of you watch, probably not. Better things to do on Thursday than watch Boris Johnson's valedictory press conference. But in his valedictory press conference, Boris Johnson had a moment of lucidity, which was quite amazing, actually, where he said he had found out, and it was a bit like Jim Hacker, you know, finding out a statistic that got past Humphrey. He said, I have found out that the price of gas generation is 9 times the price of offshore wind. Or as he put it that way around, actually, which was quite difficult to understand. But what he meant was that, right? And then he was so pleased with remembering this fact that he repeated it to a startled journalist. Did you note what I said about price of wind being 9 times cheaper than the price of gas? Yes, that's true. It is, right. Offshore wind is about £50 a megawatt hour to produce electricity at the present moment, and it's declining all the time because the technology is improving all the time. But he was standing there to announce a new nuclear program. Now, the official price of Sizewell C is £100 a megawatt hour. And that's only the official price, because that ignores all the subsidies and guarantees and construction guarantees that the nuclear industry always demands. In real terms, it's at least half as much again. So the next part of Boris Johnson's sentence should have been, and incidentally, someone has told me that the price of new nuclear is 3 times the price of offshore wind, and therefore, sensibly, we are not going to go in for a new nuclear program. What he said in contrast was, we're going to have sizable CNM, we're going to have lots of other nuclear stations. So the opportunity is this. In that, this is a guy, incidentally, who says he couldn't do anything about the cost of living crisis because he didn't want to trespass on his successor. But he's quite willing to stand up and announce billions more for the nuclear industry. It's quite extraordinary. But anyway, there is the opportunity. We know that the array of Scottish renewables, of big power, and the potential of the green hydrogen to the combination of wind and hydro and pump storage hydro in particular, can configure a Scottish electricity system that can deliver electricity to the Scottish people and sell lots to everybody else for about 1/3 of the cost of the long-term nuclear program that England is now committing itself to, with the price of nuclear likely to go up and the price of wind likely to go down, and about, let's see, it's currently about, well, Johnson's calculation is not too far wrong, about 1/9 for the cost of the gas generation that's 50% of the English electricity production at the present moment. And that's, so we know that, and let's leave to one side the fact that Scotland produces 5 times as much gas as we consume. So that is an enormous opportunity, given the fear and the interest that people have in the size of the electricity bills, to say, look, a very, in Scotland, independent Scotland, the price of electricity will be such and such. If we stay in the UK, one way or another, it's going to be such and such. 3-4 times as much. Either paid for directly in your bills or paid for through the electricity companies wanting a public subsidy to continue with their activities. That's a pretty powerful argument. And if you combine that with saying, well, for those of you who don't want to engage in billions and millions and all the rest of it, because I was once told, the sensible thing I was ever told in economics was that anything over 1 million was just a big number to most folk. But let's just talk about resources. Since the world is now being dictated by resources, control of resources and the price of resources, that we have a nap hand of resources in Scotland. We've got land, ample quantities of it, productive land. We've got water. In a world where, I was telling them meeting in Sky that I'd been looking, when I was in Catalonia actually, they were showing satellite pictures of Europe from 10 years ago, a year ago, and now. And the devastating change of, because the area of brown in the satellite images now stretches across the European continent to Yorkshire. And only Scotland, Yorkshire and Ireland look green in these satellite images. So water is going to be of substantial importance. Oil, gas and renewables coming out of our ears, all that, a nap hand of incredibly important resources in the world in which we're embarking on. And plus the ingenuity and talent of Scots domestically and worldwide is a winning economic combination. So yes, big corporate interest is a threat. It's a threat not just to the national movement of Scotland, it's a threat to the welfare of just about everybody on the planet. But it's also an opportunity to illustrate the advantages of control of our own resources in Scotland, and certainly an argument which has a winning flavour to it at the present moment, where the people will understand the opportunity that Scotland has if we have these resources under our control, as opposed to under control of big corporates and control of the Westminster government.
Thank you. Maggie.
To some extent, it's going back to the area that Sarah was talking about. When I first heard Craig Murray talking about the United Nations Committee on Decolonisation, it was like somebody switching on a big light bulb. And since then, the work that Professor Alf Baird has done around Scotland as a colony, he's done his wonderful book, Dún Hodden, that looks at right round all the aspects of the colonial mindset and so on. I thought at the SSRG conference recently, that quite a lot of that came together, and that you could see really quite a serious shift in people's thinking about Scotland as a colony, and what you've been describing in terms of your Wee ALBA Book meetings, that there are lots of people there that are now pretty seriously examining all these issues. I mean, I think now, quite soon, as you've indicated, we should be doing the preparations to take ourselves to United Nations to talk to them. We should be doing that soon. And I know that what Sarah's been saying about the need for us to be a liberation movement, not just in terms of parliamentary legitimacy, but we have to also show that we're a liberation movement also if we're going to go to United Nations. Do you see those arguments having made progress in the recent period? Because I get quite a strong sense that that has really shifted quite dramatically. And I do believe that politics can shift suddenly. And I think that is what we have been witnessing over this last period, over the last few weeks. I think we're seeing that quite seriously. Would you agree with that?
Well, Maggie, the way to look at it perhaps is this, that, you know, we've been operating in the national movement and in Scotland, you know, for the last century, let's put it that way. Let's say the democratic national movement in Scotland is about a century old.
Yeah.
And the underlying assumption through all of that time has been that Scotland, and agreed by the unionist position, you might say easy to agree when they never thought it was going to happen, but the underlying assumption is being that it's a voluntary union, and if Scotland decides it doesn't want to be in the voluntary union, then off it goes. You can argue about the process by which it's been delivered. Now, if we get to the extent of the Liz Truss confused position, you know, she seems to think you can deny the right of self-determination on the basis that she thinks the union is a family. I mean, I don't know how far she's thought of this, incidentally, because, you know, if families don't always stay together, but nobody would ever suggest that people should be kept in families against their will, for example. But you know, we mustn't look for any deep analysis. But if you get from the likes of Liz Truss, but if you get to the stage where that voluntary acceptance that Scotland's in a voluntary union is no longer the case, then you're in a different realm of politics. It doesn't stop the importance of domestic action, in particular assertion through your parliamentary representatives, because they're crucial. But it means that you move from the realm of domestic law to international law. And there are well-trodden paths of this, of many countries who've done this. And therefore, I agree. I think the case should be prepared and made, and the case that would be made is quite clear. It's the case in terms of the United Nations Charter, on the Helsinki Accords, on the European Convention in terms of the right of freedom of expression, and in a variety of other international authorities. And Craig and others have written about this rather well. You can use the UK government's own declarations against itself, their opinion on Kosovo, for example, but they made the very strong point that, you know, if independence movements had depended on the assent of the successor state, you'd never have any independence movements, because the successor state normally says no. And a very powerful point. I don't know quite how that one sneaked out of the Foreign Office, but it most certainly did. So lots of arguments, good case to be prepared. Lots of international authorities go to, and a process which is very, very good because it interests the world and what's happening in Scotland. But at the end of the day, such appeals will only be successful if Scots exhibit the political determination in Scotland. They can only be built upon that rock.
Yeah.
And our job in ALBA is to make sure the mush that's there at the present moment is crystallized into that rock, or alternatively, the people seek other representatives who are prepared to do the job, as the Declaration of Arbroath pointed to all of these years ago. Fortunately for those who who sealed the declaration, good King Robert was well up to the task. So they didn't have to engage in replacing him. So let's hope our good parliamentary representatives are up to the task as well.
Thank you.
Definitely. We got on the
Maggie, I
chat.
was just going to say that maybe another 10 minutes. Would that be all right for people?
Yeah, should be fine. We got one question on the chat at this point, but Peter, if you want to ask the question yourself, you're muted. You're muted. There you go.
Sorry, I thought it was best you just ask it. Alex, I was just wondering if standing candidates, all roads seem to lead to GE 2024, in my opinion, but maybe not. But if it is GE 2024, would standing candidates against in selected seats against SNP put the ultimate pressure on them to act? There are between 5 and 9 candidates, I imagine, who will have great difficulty being re-elected.
Well, there's a range of things you could do, Peter. I mean, obviously, our MPs will be standing again on the platform of Sovereignty for Scotland and Action, being part of the rock, let's put it that way, of Scottish sovereignty. We are proposing, and that will be elucidated at our conference in October, which I hope everybody who can attend will attend, in Stirling, which will set out this strategy in no uncertain terms. We'll be proposing that there is a Scotland United approach. If that is rebuffed, and that is not the approach that the others want to take, then we'll have to decide what other seats we intervene in and why. I think that would be to put it as fairly as we can. But I mean, you talk about there's a range of options there, but the preference would be, if it comes to a general election, quote, plebiscite election, the preference would be to fight it in a Scotland United ticket. I mean, after all, it worked for Lloyd George. I mean, if it worked for Lloyd George, then our father certainly knew about it.
If there aren't any more questions, and I want to hand it over to Maggie. Mute again.
You're on mute, Maggie.
There you go.
Not difficult. I do that all the time.
Back. Well, I think we've given it a very good go, and I'm going to ask Raymond to propose a vote of thanks.
We, ALBA International Branch, and everybody in attendance today would like to thank you for all your efforts, not just for the Wee ALBA Book meeting today, but all you do for Scotland and the way we as branches are able to work with you on a personal basis as well. It's an honor to work with you towards restoring Scotland's independence. Through working with you and Tasmina, we have started to reach out within the international community and building on the international link to take us forward towards Scottish independence, something that is a necessity if we all want to take Scotland out of this colonial mess it is in now. And the exciting new phase of Salvo comes into that too. Again, thank you for your time, work and cooperation. Your ALBA International Executive Committee.
Thanks very much, guys. Firstly, can I just say a word or two in conclusion? Firstly, thanks to Maggie for your chairwomanship, Maggie. The Wee ALBA Books around the country have by and large been chaired by Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh, so it's the most extraordinary and wonderful chair. And but you've done a great job today, Maggie, because I know how difficult it is, particularly in these Zoom meetings, to bring everybody in and to have all the balls in the air at the same time. So thank you so much for that. And can also thank Raymond and colleagues for the work they're doing, which will soon come to fruition in terms of a range of meetings internationally. Very, very important indeed. And ALBA International's role perhaps is providing some further intellectual firepower on key issues. I think it's going to be important as well. So I think, 16 months into formation, we've got to a stage where we can see a clear route for ALBA International's contribution to the future success of the party. Because I do believe that on that future success, some great aspect of the success of the national movement as a whole probably chiefly depends. I think ALBA and others are necessary at the present moment to drive this this debate in terms of action forward. Thank you.
Thank you.